And they're like, alright man, well, you chose death, we're gonna execute you. And they throw him off the ramparts of the city to his death. And there's like the quote from the text, essentially, it's like, and there were many who thought it was just. So... Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel, and welcome to my YouTube project, Makeup and Middle-earth Monday, a show where I do a makeup look and talk about a topic I picked out from the Tolkien Legendarium. Today's topic, Elven Realms and Cities of Middle-earth, was chosen by my friends who were kind enough to vote in the poll on my Facebook page. If you want to contribute your opinion on the next topic, please consider checking out my Facebook page as well. Link is in the description box below. I'm going to be doing things a little differently this week because this is such a huge topic. I'll be breaking it up into 2 videos. So the first one that I'm doing today is going to be covering Elven realms founded before or during the First Age, and then in 2 weeks I'll be doing the second part of this, which will be covering Elven realms that were created in the Second and Third Ages. So please tune in 2 weeks for that. This week's makeup look is going to be a drow look. This character, actually, I had initially put together for a LARP, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, I haven't actually had a chance to wear it yet. So I'm doing the makeup test for this. For clarification's sake, the Elven realms of Middle-earth are only going to be those in Middle-earth, so I'm not going to be covering Elven cities and regions in Valinor, which there are a few, and it's a different topic. So I'm going to be getting started in the years of the trees before the First Age begins. So before the First Age, in Year of the Trees 1050, the elves awoke for the first time in this place called Cuiviénen. Cuiviénen is a Quenya word that actually means water of awakening, and this place was described as being on the shore of a large gulf in the inland sea of Helcar. The area was formed by a rush of waters in the wake of the destruction of the Pillar of Helcar, which had held one of the first lights that the Valar had made for Middle-earth before the Sun and Moon and before the 2 trees. And Melkor had destroyed these pillars with the lights before the elves were around, essentially, as far as I know. Cuiviénen was on the far eastern side of Middle-earth, near where the Sea of Rune is in Third Age Middle-earth maps. And for reference, Easterlings come from the lands to the east of where Cuiviénen used to be. We know that the first elves dwelt there for many, many years, but eventually Melkor noticed them there, I guess, and decided he was going to start terrorizing them. Once the Valar realized what was happening, though, the hunter Vala Orome came to Cuiviénen and began to guide the elves westward, eventually to the sea, so that he could take them to Valinor. But not all of the elves really wanted to go, and that's really where the first sundering of the different kindreds of elves happened. And this is also when we start to see the first Elven realms in Middle-earth start to become distinct from each other as they left Cuiviénen. And like most places the elves lived in before and during the First Age, Cuiviénen no longer exists. One of the places that the elves stopped on their journey west was another area called Atiamar, and they built a settlement there by the river Anduin, and they would not move on for quite some time until eventually the weather started to grow hostile and destroyed their homes and forced them to keep moving. Another one of the places that the elves stopped on their journey westward was this forest called Greenwood the Great. And this was and remains the largest forest in Middle-earth. This is where most of the Sylvan elves ended up settling, and it was approximately, this is how big this place was, 600 miles long from north to south, and around 250 miles across. It had 2 rivers. One was large, and it was kind of labeled on maps as the Forest River. And the other was a stream that carried an enchantment. Anyone who made contact with its black waters would suffer hallucinations and amnesia. The Cinder Elf Orifer ruled here until he was killed during the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, after which his son, Thranduil, became king, Thranduil being Legolas's father. About 1,000 years into the Third Age, Greenwood the Great became known as Mirkwood, thanks to the Necromancer, aka Sauron, taking up residence at Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood. And his corruption, kind of polluted the area around it, which, yay, included the infestation of giant spiders. Woo, awesome, love those things, don't you? Isn't that great? In response to the area growing more dangerous, Thranduil moved his people to the northern part of Mirkwood, and he built a cave system there known as the Elven King's Halls. This is where Thorin's company and the Hobbit were held captive for a time. The Elven King's Halls were accessible only through a set of giant stone doors, and when these doors were closed, they were sealed magically. And beneath the dungeons of this place, and the dungeons being where Thorin's company were held captive, they had an underground cellar that connected to the underground river that allowed them to return barrels and stuff to Lake Town. And Galadriel actually eventually came and destroyed Dol Guldur herself. And after the destruction of Sauron's Ring of Power, at the end of the Third Age, the southern part of the forest became East Lorien for a little while, and Thranduil renamed Mirkwood itself to Erin Lascalen, which means the Wood of Green Leaves. And I know I said I was going to be covering places founded before or during the First Age. I'm actually going to save Lothlorien for the second part of this video, just because I have a lot of ground to cover, and I don't want to not give myself enough time or have to cut it out and then refilm it, so I'm going to cover that next time. But yes, technically, Lorien was formed in the Years of the Trees as well, far before the Years of the Sun. But for the interest of brevity, I'm going to come back to that next time. And there were Sindarin elves that settled there as well, obviously. But they also continued journeying westward. And then there were more Sindarin elves, obviously, who remained in Middle-earth. Many of them followed King Thingol. After the sundering of the elves, Thingol remained in Middle-earth and went on to rule essentially all of Beleriand for a while. It was just him as like the king of all Beleriand. And the area that he ruled from came to be known as Doriath, though it did have a few names other than that. Doriath is the one that you're gonna hear most mentioned, so that would be the one that I would recommend remembering. Doriath was located in central Beleriand, and King Thingol ruled there with his wife Melian, and Melian was actually not an elf, she was a Maya. They essentially met during the journey westward, and they fell in love, and Thingol went missing for like, I think like a couple centuries, and they were just together until his people found them, and then they went and built Doriath, or they went and built Menegroth, which is where he ruled from in Doriath. Menegroth was the capital of Doriath. It was an underground city, or stronghold, yeah, it was an underground city. Melian had very strong magic, and she also had quite the gift for kind of seeing what was coming and knowing how to respond to it, which, you know, that would be great, but he didn't always listen to her, even though he probably should have, but that's a topic for another day. Melian more or less foretold a time when Melkor would return and start causing problems, because when Doriath was first founded and when they first built Menegroth, Morgoth was in Valinor, you know, after having been taken into custody for the first time, but she foretold of a time when he would return and start causing problems again. So Thingol did some things to ensure the protection of his people. Melian herself protected the realm of Doriath with a shield of magic that was known as the Girdle of Melian. This prevented anyone from entering Doriath without their permission. Except for one dude, but that's for a later video. Doriath is actually Sindarin for Land of the Fence, so once again with Elvish place names, it's shaped like itself. The capital of Doriath was Menegroth, or the Thousand Caves. Thranduil, when he built the halls of the Elven King, and Mirkwood actually took inspiration from Menegroth when he built that, but that was on a significantly smaller scale. Thingol enlisted the help of the dwarves to build Menegroth. It was built in the hills and only had one way to get in and out over a stone bridge. It was intended to, you know, essentially be a place that they could fortify against Melkor when the time came. And this place was, like, super cool. There's a lot of really beautiful poetic verse describing it, which obviously I'm not going to read on this show because I have to look into a mirror and make sure that what I'm doing is I'm doing properly. This is drow makeup. Can you tell? But the Lay of Leithian actually describes it in a really beautiful verse, having carvings of dragons with jewels in their eyes and their teeth made of bone. And in addition to that, you know, Melian's nightingales were said to have been in, like, the boughs of these really beautiful, like, stone-carved trees that supported, like, the ceiling above them. And the ceiling was actually illuminated with elven imitations of what would have been the sun and moon, I guess. And they were wrought from gems. And I will read, like, one line, and it says, "There a light like day immortal and like night of stars unclouded shone and gleamed." That just sounds so pretty to me. I love anything that glows, though. I'm always a slut for shit that glows. And the branches supporting leaves in these trees were said to be made of gold. They were filled with gems, and they described, like, fountains bubbling in the stonework in the king's halls. So obviously Doriath was pretty dope. Unfortunately, as with many elven kingdoms in the First Age, I would say as with the majority of elven kingdoms that were around in the First Age, it no longer exists. It was sacked twice. Once by dwarves, when Thingol said, like, some really racist shit to them, that, you know, really... I don't know what he expected to happen. But it was sacked first by dwarves, and then again it was sacked about 500 years into the First Age when the Sons of Feanor came looking for a Silmaril that Thingol's successor at the time possessed. So that was a whole other horrible piece of drama. And, you know, the Sons of Feanor are pretty big assholes, so... yeah, that's Doriath. I think it sounds really cool. It's a shame, like with most of these places, it doesn't exist anymore. Now, we get to, I would say, probably the westernmost settlement of elves during the migration. They ended up at the Havens of the Falas. A group of Teleri elves settled in this region, led by Círdan the Shipwright. Fun fact, Círdan is actually, as far as we know, the only elf that was ever described as having a beard, which he's actually in the prologue of the Peter Jackson movies, and he doesn't have a beard in the prologue, which, he doesn't have a beard. But, like, I could kind of understand why they decided not to do that, because how would you explain that to people? Like, people who aren't familiar with the books, like, people who just, like, aren't familiar with, like, either, like, the Silmarillion or the appendices, like, how would you explain that to people? Yeah, elves don't have beards, except for one guy. Just one guy, though. So yeah, I can understand why Mr. Peter Jackson decided not to put the beard on Círdan in like the 0.3 seconds that he was on screen in the prologue. But yeah, so that's where that's where he ruled. Eventually he goes on to establish the Grey Havens, but that's like part 2 video. That's not for today. But the Havens of the Thalas, the elves that decided to stay there essentially decided to stay because they really loved the sea and the coast, and they didn't want to leave it, which, you know, a lot of elves are known for having a sea longing, so this is just kind of reinforcing that trait with the reader, I think. And in the Thalas, they built 2 different walled settlements, like two different like great walled cities, I guess. One was called Eglarest, and it was built at the mouth of the river Nenning, and then the other was called Brithombar, and it was built at the mouth of the river Brithon. And these havens endured war with Morgoth's forces for several centuries until they finally fell in First Age year 473, forcing their inhabitants to flee. Some of them, including Círdan, fled to the Isle of Balar, and others fled to the Havens at Sirion. The Isle of Balar is actually where Círdan helped the elf Eärendil, Elrond's father, build his boat the Vingalot, and the Havens of Sirion were later attacked by several sons of Feanor. Again, seeking another Silmaril. Well, it's the same Silmaril, but seeking a Silmaril that had been brought there by the daughter of Thingol's heir after they sacked Doriath. And they pursued her all the way over here, more or less, but she actually fled into the sea with the Silmaril and was rescued by Eärendil, whom she eventually ended up marrying, and together they sailed to Valinor to plead with the Valar for help against Morgoth. Now, Thranduil's Third Age halls were not the only elvish city inspired by Thingol's Menegroth. Nargothrond was another one, and this one was built by Galadriel's eldest brother Finrod, whom, if you watched last week's video, you should be intimately familiar with. And he also enlisted the help of the dwarves building this. It wasn't quite a city so much as it was a stronghold, but it was another subterranean elvish city, stronghold, whatever, that was built to be fortifiable against the threat that Morgoth was eventually going to pose. And like Thingol, Finrod also enlisted the help of the dwarves to build Nargothrond. Nargothrond was the only Noldorine city or settlement, stronghold, whatever, that was like actually considered an ally by King Thingol for, you know, kinslaying reasons, because the people that Feanor and his followers killed during the kinslaying were Teleri elves, and they were like the Sindarin elves that settled in this area were Teleri elves, you know, that stayed, so they were categorized differently, but they were King Thingol's relatives, so he didn't really want anything to do with most of the Noldor. But he was fine with Finrod because Finrod wasn't involved in the kinslaying, and that's why he was also fine with like Galadriel and, you know, everyone from that family. And Thingol was actually the one who gave Finrod advice on like where he could build his hidden fortress. Finrod basically visited King Thingol and was like, hey, this Menegroth place is super cool. I'd love to build something like this. Do you have any advice? And Thingol recommended he check the cave systems near the river Naurog, and that's where Finrod ended up building Nargothrond. In the process, he earned his nickname Felagund, which is a Cinderized version of a Khuzdul word that means maker of caves. It took him about 50 years to complete Nargothrond, and like I said, it was with the help of the dwarves, whom he paid really well, and they were so pleased with how well he paid them and like the cool shit that he gave them that they made him this like really pretty necklace called the Naglamir, which means it basically means like the necklace of the dwarves. And he kept that in his treasure hoard. Nargothrond had 3 main great halls that were surrounded by lesser cave systems. When Finrod built it, the only way in was down a narrow path along the riverbank, and Morgoth couldn't figure out, like, how to get to them. So this city, you know, he couldn't figure out how to get to them for several hundred years. So this city lasted for, you know, a decent chunk of time. However, when Finrod died, his nephew took over, and his nephew, Orodrith, let's say, was not quite as wise as his uncle, so he made some questionable decisions and followed some advice that I personally probably, if I was, you know, 1,000-year-old elf, probably wouldn't have followed, but maybe I have a higher wisdom stat than Orodrith. I don't know. Basically what happened was Turin Turambar came to Nargothrond seeking sanctuary, and that's a whole other topic about Turin and the children of Húrin, but he essentially is a human man who came seeking sanctuary, and the elves welcomed him in, and while he was staying there, he eventually became, like, one of Orodreth's most trusted advisors. And I will say that, you know, Turin meant well. Like, he wasn't a bad dude. It was just, he was very prideful and he was very stubborn. And so he made some very questionable decisions, and most of them were based on, like, pride, which really is, you know, a prevailing theme in a lot of Tolkienian stuff, is that pride comes before a fall, and, like, the hubris of man, and, you know, all that jazz. He essentially convinced King Orodrith that instead of using, like, guerrilla tactics to fight Morgoth, which is what the elves had been doing rather successfully for the last several hundred years from Nargothrond, that they should just, like, make a big bridge in front of the city and march out across it and fight Morgoth in, like, actual pitched battle, I guess, because that's cooler than using guerrilla tactics. And I'm sure you can imagine how well that went for the elves of this city, going up against, like, a bunch of Morgoth's forces in pitched battle when they've essentially been, you know, geared up and trained to do guerrilla warfare for centuries. That doesn't seem like a great idea to me. I'll just say that. And it wasn't a great idea, because Morgoth was like, cool, I know where you are now. This giant bridge of yours is really easy to see, and it's also super duper easy to cross. So he defeated their army, like, in the fields, pretty much. And then he was like, look at this beautiful bridge. They built the bridge too good, so they couldn't destroy it. And he sent the dragon Glaurung across it to basically ruin the rest of their day. And that's how Nargothrond fell. Poor choices. Morgoth's forces killed and enslaved a lot of the inhabitants of Nargothrond, and then the ones that he didn't kill were forced to flee to Doriath to seek shelter there, and that was actually how King Thingol at the time was still king when Nargothrond fell, and that was how he found out that Nargothrond fell, was because a bunch of people came seeking shelter in Doriath afterwards. So, R.I.P. man. And Glaurung the dragon made himself at home in Finrod's treasure hoard, and after, you know, defeating Nargothrond, and he stayed there for several years. And then eventually the actual, like, fortress was completely destroyed when Beleriand was destroyed at the end of the First Age, along with most of these other places. We got one familiar one in here, though. Mirkwood's been around for a long-ass time. And so has Lorien, but I'm not covering that in this episode. I'm gonna mention it next week. Don't kill me. And now we're gonna move on. Another region that was colonized by the Noldor very soon after they finished crossing the ice desert of the Helcaraxe. This area was, like, north, like, just north of Beleriand, and it was colonized and ruled by Fingolfin, who became the High King of the Noldor, and his son Fingon. The mountains of Hithlum served as a natural defense against Morgoth's forces, and when rivers of fire poured out of Angband during the Battle of Sudden Flame, roughly 400 years into the First Age, these mountains protected Hithlum from being destroyed by the lava and stuff. After Fingolfin was killed, Fingon, his son, ruled as High King of the Noldor until Hithlum was finally lost in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, aka the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. It was, like Nargothrond, completely destroyed when Beleriand was destroyed. And of course the Nirnaeth Arnoediad being the battle during which Fingon was also killed. And then his son Gil-galad became the High King of the Noldor. Nevrost was another place in Beleriand that the Noldor settled really early into their arrival back in Middle-earth, but it had previously had some Sindarin elves there. Turgon ruled here for a time while he was building the city of Gondolin, and while he was here in Nevrost, he built the city of Vinyamar, which his people inhabited for the duration of Gondolin's construction. But once Gondolin was finished, they abandoned Vinyamar and moved there instead. That was roughly 100 years into the First Age, and after they abandoned it, Vinyamar fell into disrepair and eventually was also destroyed when Beleriand was, but it was never actually attacked or damaged by Morgoth. It just fell into disrepair when it became uninhabited. And then, of course, we have Gondolin. Essentially, Finrod built Nargothrond, and his cousin Turgon was, with him when they had the vision sent to them from the Vala Ulmo. They both had the same vision, but because they never, shared this vision with each other, they had no idea that they both had this idea that they needed to build something that would be safe to hide from Morgoth and his forces. Just gonna glue these ears on real quick. If you watched my previous video, you know that I hate putting makeup on my ears because it just makes me... I just don't like it. I don't like it. I'll do it, but I don't like it. Also, Prozaid is the best thing ever. I hate spirit gum. I refuse to use it ever. It melts in the heat. It flakes. It's gross. Prozaid is really where it's at. This stuff holds up. So, in case you had ever wondered if you can just pop your ears on over your ear piercings, hopefully this has answered your question. And, I like to put the wig on before I'm done with the full look, because I need to see, where is going to be covered by the lace and all that, how much I'm going to need to blend out towards the ears, that kind of thing. This is just an Amazon lace front wig. I styled it myself, obviously, but I want to know where I got it from. Amazon is the answer. Yeah, so there's a few spots that I need to go over with makeup, but anyway, we have Gondolin, and Gondolin actually means hidden rock in Sindarin. In the later versions of the text, Gondolin became, one of its titles was the Seven Named City, and I'm just gonna read, a little baby excerpt, which said, if this is from the Lay of the Fall of Gondolin, rejoice that ye have found it, and rest from endless war, for the Seven Named City 'tis that stands upon the hill, when all who strive with Morgoth find hope and valor still. Unlike Nargothrond, which was built more like a fortress, Gondolin was an entire hidden city. It was in northern Beleriand and constructed in the Valley of Tumladen, and this valley was hidden by these mountains that were called the Encircling Mountains. The area was actually guarded by the Great Eagles, which flew overhead and patrolled. Gondolin itself was in the center of this valley, and it was up on a hill that had been formed when the valley had originally been full of water before the valley had been drained. The only way in was through a ravine called the Orfalch Echor, which took travelers through like a dried riverbed to the first gate of Gondolin. And Gondolin had 7 gates, in fact, and they were the Gate of Wood, the Gate of Stone, the Gate of Bronze, the Gate of Writhen Iron, the Gate of Silver, the Gate of Gold, and the Gate of Steel, which, damn, that's a lot of gates. Gondolin's original name was Ondolinde, which is Quenya for the Rock of the Music of Water. It was named after the springs of Amon Gwareth. That was later cinderized into Gondolin. The city took a little over 50 years to build. When it was complete, the Vala Ulmo actually came to Turgon again and was basically like, so I'm gonna protect you guys as best as I can with like the surrounding areas of water, but Melkor's gonna figure out where you are eventually, and the city is gonna fall because of treachery. So just be on the lookout for that, and you will have like someone's gonna come and like warn you before this happens, so you will have time to prepare. And the people who are warning you are going to be coming from like the Nevrast region, so that's fine, I guess, but things don't really turn out so super great. So after the elves started moving into Gondolin, they kept building onto the city until it was nice enough to, like, honestly, it was nice enough to rival like a city in Valinor. That was how nice they made it. And Turgon himself built this thing that was called the Tower of the King, and on it he crafted these 2 trees, one of gold and one of silver, that illuminated the streets of Gondolin. And the gold one was called Glingal, and the silver one was called Belthil. And they were made after, you know, the memory of the 2 trees of Valinor that were destroyed. These 2 trees were supposedly, like, really, really pretty. So we can see, like, the loss of these 2 trees, like the original 2 trees of Valinor, really have some, like, long-reaching consequences and stuff. They really stuck with the elves. Like, that's how beloved the 2 trees were. So, for about 200 years, the city was peaceful. However, eventually, Turgon's sister Ardavel got tired of being cooped up and really wanted to go out and do things. She was a very active person. She really loved hunting and riding and, you know, doing, like, adventuring things. And she, you know, she had some bad taste because she really liked doing those things with the Sons of Feanor, especially Celegorm and Crúfin, who are arguably the worst 2 of the Sons of Feanor. That's just my opinion. But she really wanted to go out and do stuff, and eventually Turgon was like, okay, fine, you know, go on and live your life, but you have to promise that you're just gonna go visit our brother Fingon in his city, and not just, like, wander around Middle-earth doing dangerous shit. And she was like, yeah, totally, I'll absolutely do that. And guess what she doesn't do? That. She ends up going to hang out with the Sons of Feanor instead, and they end up getting separated. So she goes and finds, like, the area that they've been living in, and they're not there. The people welcome her and, like, let her chill there because they know that, like, she's friends with the Sons of Feanor, but she gets tired of waiting for them. Exercising some fantastic elven wisdom, she just decides to, like, leave and start wandering around. And I'm not trying to blame the victim here, but, like, ma'am, you made some bad choices, and I don't understand, like, I don't understand what you expected, because at this point, like, Morgoth is, you know, kind of a huge threat, and Gondolin had this, like, the reason that the city stayed hidden was because it had this policy where if you arrived there, you could stay, but you were never allowed to leave, because, you know, Morgoth was looking for Gondolin, and they didn't want him to find it. So if you found it, you weren't allowed to leave, which I think that's kind of fair. But, you know, she's the king's sister, so I guess that makes her special. And guess what? She doesn't get kidnapped by Morgoth, but she does get kidnapped by this dude called Eöl the Dark Elf. And when I say Dark Elf, I don't mean like this, like drow. I mean, in Tolkien, Dark Elves, they were called the Morroquendi versus the Calaquendi, who would be the elves who saw the light of the trees. The Morroquendi were the elves who didn't go back to Valinor and have never or have never like witnessed the light of the two trees that were in Valinor. This wig is migrating slowly backwards off of my head. Yeah, so he didn't see the two trees, but I think that they also probably like the Dark Elf, because he was kind of a dickhead, and he wove like this magic spell that like made her get lost in his woods, because like he saw her riding around and he wanted her, and so she got lost and he took her in and they got married. And that's kind of, you know, questionably consensual, because he was like super duper controlling, and eventually, like, you know, like he'd let her like travel and do stuff in the woods, but he wouldn't let her go home, and he wouldn't let her like send word to like her brother or anybody to know that she was okay. And mind you, she's been missing for a while now. Like, she's missing for like 80 years total. During that time, she and Eöl have a son, which, yeah, that happened. She's like super duper homesick by this point, and so like she tells their son stories about Gondolin and how awesome it is and how she really wants to go back there, but they're not allowed to. And then one day her son is like, well, I mean, we could just leave. Why don't we just leave? And this is when Eöl the Dark Elf is like doing whatever it is that he does in the woods. I think he's like mining for ore. So they take the opportunity to escape while he's gone. So they decide to go back to Gondolin while Eöl is out and about. He ends up getting back sooner than they expected and realizes that they're gone. So he tracks them, because, you know, he's a really good tracker. And he tracks them all the way back to Gondolin when they get there, you know, and they get to Gondolin, and Turgon is like, wow, you've been gone for 80 years. What the hell happened to you? And so he meets his new nephew. His new nephew's name is Maeglin, by the way. And Maeglin is, you know, pretty much welcome there because he's the son of the king's sister. But Eöl follows them there, and he gets taken into custody. And Turgon is like, you know, ready to welcome this guy into his family because it's his sister's husband. And he's like, oh yeah, you got married while you were gone. That tracks, I guess. You know, whatever. Your husband's here now. He's welcome to stay. Like, you can live here. And Eöl was like, no, I don't want to live here because I want to live in my woods. My wife and my son should be living with me. And Turgon is like, well, you can't leave. That's the law. Sorry, buddy. You're just gonna have to sit here. And he was basically like, you can either stay here or we're gonna kill you. Like, those are your choices. You can either stay here or die. And Eöl was like, well, fine, I choose to die. But my son is also going to die because he's my son. So he throws his javelin at his son, and Aradel, obviously being a mother, steps in front of the javelin and gets hit with it instead of her son, saving her son's life. And she takes a wound, and we think maybe she's going to be okay because it's not like a super duper bad wound. But Eöl the Dark Elf is a fucking asshole, and she died because the weapon that he used to like hit her was poisonous. So Turgon is understandably kind of pissed off that his sister, who has been missing for 80 years, that finally returned home, was just murdered in front of his eyes. So they take Eöl the Dark Elf, and they're like, alright man, well, you chose death, we're gonna execute you, and they throw him off the ramparts of the city to his death. And there's like the quote from the text, essentially, it's like, and there were many who thought it was just. So this dickhead, this controlling kind of asshole gets thrown off the ramparts of the city, and pretty much everybody was like, yeah, that fucking dick deserved it. So Maeglin ends up staying in the city with his new family, and he falls in love with this woman, this elf woman named Idril was the name of the lady that Maeglin fell in love with. And Maeglin became, like, you know, pretty important in Gondolin because he was the nephew of the king, but Idril was Turgon's daughter, so he fell in love with his cousin, and, you know, elves don't marry their first cousins because that's kind of gross. And she was also aware of the fact that he liked her and thought that he was super gross also for liking her, so she quote-unquote despised him for it. Eventually, this dude named Tuor comes to Gondolin, and he's the one that carries the warning that Ulmo foretold, the warning of the destruction of Gondolin. Tuor is a human. He is also a man from the House of Hador, and this is the same house of people that Turin Turambar was from, and Turin Turambar is the one who kind of Nargothrond up. But Tuor shows up, and he's like, hey, bad times are a-comin'. And Maeglin really didn't like this dude. He argued against him, and the arguments that he made were pretty instrumental in convincing Turgon not to leave Gondolin, even though Ulmo had been like, yeah, you're gonna have to leave eventually, and this is gonna be your early warning sign, so good job, Maeglin, you fucking suck. But just wait, because it gets better. Maeglin, like his dad, also would, you know, like to mine for ore, and like the area near to Gondolin was really rich in like really nice ore. He's actually the one who built like the great steel gate, the great gate of steel. That was him. But he is, you know, out in the hills mining for ore when, guess what happens? He gets found by Morgoth's forces and taken prisoner. Wow, it's almost like people shouldn't be leaving Gondolin. So yeah, he gets taken prisoner, and like, I think pretty much before like anything happens, because like, you know, Morgoth is like, I'm gonna torture you for information, and Maeglin is basically like, you don't have to torture me, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, just don't kill me. And so he gives up the location of Gondolin and gives up how to get to it, and good job, you know, hooray, we've lost Gondolin now. So when Morgoth's forces were attacking and overrunning the city, Maeglin tried to kidnap Idril, and he ended up fighting Tuor on the walls of the city, but Tuor won and threw him off the wall to his death, just like his daddy. So I'm sure many thought that was just as well. And Maeglin was actually really young when he died. Like for an elf, he was only like 200 almost, like not even quite 200 years old. So, you know, I guess some character flaws are genetic. So there was a great siege on the city. Morgoth's forces marched in from the north, and they attacked when Gondolin was actually preparing for a festival. It was like a festival that was intended to like welcome the sun, but instead of welcoming the sun, the siege on this city started, and like Morgoth came with like wolves and orcs and dragons and multiple Balrogs. A lot of the captains of the noble houses of Gondolin fell, and the Tower of the King was actually destroyed during this. And King Turgon was actually killed trying to defend the tower when the tower was destroyed and when the tower fell. And then, of course, after Tuor and Idril got away from Maeglin, well, after Tuor threw Maeglin off of the battlements, they escaped through a tunnel and led the people who survived the fall of Gondolin to the mountains of Sirion, where, you know, that's where a lot of other Elven refugees ended up. And Gondolin was the last city to really resist Morgoth. So when they fell, they were like one of the last like major cities to go. And Eärendil, after he grew up, because when he was from Gondolin, and his parents were Idril and Tuor, so that's, you know, the half elf. He was the one who, like I said earlier in the video, navigated to Valinor to plead with the Valar to come help, because things were just so bad in Middle-earth by this point. So, to tie up everything with this, I'm gonna do this just to kind of help give some more context, and with something that is a little bit more accessible to people who didn't read the Silmarillion. Gondolin is a place where some very famous weapons were created. I'm gonna go through a couple of them right now. The Gondolindrim were the army of the people there. They were known for having blades that glowed. I think the passage is with a white fire in reaction to, like, the presence of orcs. So several weapons that were forged in Gondolin were found by Thorin's company in the Third Age. One of them was Orcrist, the Goblin Cleaver, which had potentially already killed like hundreds of goblins in the Elder Days before Thorin picked it up. Another of these swords was called Glamdring the Foe Hammer. This sword was originally made for King Turgon himself, and this later became Gandalf's sword. Then, of course, there's Sting, which was a short sword that Bilbo named, and this one, I think, was actually the only one specifically mentioned to glow blue when orcs are nearby. But I'm pretty sure in the books they all would have had some sort of glow. I know in the Hobbit movie and in the Lord of the Rings movies, Sting is the only sword that glows at all. I don't believe that's accurate, but that's another thing where I'm kind of like, maybe they just thought that would be a little bit too difficult to explain in like a concise way. But it shouldn't, I don't think it should have been the only one that glowed, but it might have been the only one that glowed blue. So, yeah, my research was a little inconclusive about that. But I will say that I'm going to quote Keep on Tolkien again, which is my favorite Tolkien podcast. You should check them out because they're what inspired me to do this show, and they're really entertaining. But Danny from that podcast has a really cool theory that, like, once I heard it, I was like, yo, I like that a lot. And his theory is actually that Sting was originally made for Eärendil as, like, a child sword that he maybe had for, like, ceremonial purposes. He probably would have had, like, some kind of regalia. And I really love that theory. I think that's a really interesting theory, and I personally want to make it my headcanon because it's a good theory. Like, you know, there's no way to prove it because it's kind of, you know, it's one of the mysteries of these books, but like I really love that theory. Also, Eärendil is actually Elrond's father, so that's another little nugget of context from the First Age here. He was Elrond's father. Oh, this friggin' wig. See, my problem is that I should have lined, like, the entire edge of my forehead with this tape, but I don't want to because I am taking this off as soon as this video is over. Ugh. I have such a huge forehead, and yet I still have this problem. Why does God hate me? But anyway, this is the makeup look. This is the character that eventually I will hopefully be able to play somewhere. Anyway, like I said, I'm gonna go into Lothlorien in the next episode just because I wanted a little bit more time to cover the Fall of Gondolin. It is one of my most favorite stories in the Tolkien Legendarium. I think it's really interesting world building, and it's a very extensive topic. And I really only just, like, I know I went in, I did kind of go into it today, but there's, like, so much more to it that really would fill its own episode if I allowed myself to do that. But this is the look. I made this and this also. I made this whole thing. I may do like a kit tour later, I guess, but I did this is hand embroidered. I didn't make the embroidery pattern, I downloaded it off of a website that I'll also include in the link below, but I did do the embroidery by hand. So I'm gonna brag about that because that shit is time consuming and I want people to see it. My body paint really has come a long way since I used to cosplay Homestuck. Boy howdy. Yeah, you know, if I was actually at game I would put makeup on here, but like, since this is for a video, I'm not gonna. Anyway, now that we've reached the end, it's time for a little segment that I like to call Metal Music Monday. This is where I pick a song from my metal library and recommend it to you. Maybe we like the same music, maybe it's new to you. Either way, I hope you enjoy it. The song of the week this week is called Invoking the Woodland Spirit by the band Elven. I felt like this may be a fitting song to pick for this week's topic, and it flows nicely with the MMM playlist that I'm putting together on Spotify that I guess I'll be making public once there's more than 3 songs on it. But I hope you enjoy the music, and I hope that you enjoyed our time together. I know I did, but even if you didn't, I appreciate you giving me the chance. If you did enjoy, I would love it if you gave me a like or a comment, or even if you were willing to hit that subscribe button. But if not, thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.